We are parents, teachers, and educators, and like you, we're passionate about restoring our culture for Christ. This is Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education.
Hello again, I'm Marlon Detweiler, and you've joined us for another episode of Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education. Today we have with us Dr. Daniel Coupland, who hails from Hillsdale College. Daniel, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Marlon. It's great to be here.
Well, it's nice to have you here. We always like to start, or generally we start with getting a little bit of personal background. Tell us a little bit about your family, your education, and your career path that led you to Hillsdale.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm very, very grateful to have grown up in a Christian home. I had two very godly parents who trained me and my two older sisters, from a very young age, to follow God and to trust Christ for our salvation. And I'm very, very grateful for that. They were missionaries with an evangelical organization, and so the Christian life was just a part of our life. And I'm so grateful for that. And I even remind my own children, that they have a heritage, that their grandparents actually on both sides of our family, that have kind of passed on that Christian heritage. So I grew up in a Christian home. I went to Liberty University as an undergrad. I met my wife there, who is a nurse. And in fact, I teach at Hillsdale College, and not even a half a mile from where I am right now, my wife runs the health clinic on campus. So we're kind of all in here. Yeah. All in here at Hillsdale College. After graduating from Liberty, I actually taught in a public school for about 5 years, and enjoyed interacting with the students, but at the same time found it quite frustrating at times. In terms of low academic standards, and also just in terms of the limitations of being able to talk about my faith in class as well. One thing I really enjoyed, though, while I was a teacher, is helping to what we would now use in kind of business terms, onboarding new teachers. And so I realized if I wanted to do that for a living, I would have to go back to school. So I had earned a master's while I was a teacher, going to night school into summer school, but after 5 years, I quit my job and I went back to Michigan State and pursued a degree in education. Again, I found that very frustrating because predominantly the field of education, what I would call the education establishment, is controlled by, for lack of a better term, progressives, or people who, when I was in grad school 25, 30 years ago, it was critical theorists. And so I found that very frustrating as a person who really didn't understand classical education at the time, but I just knew, because of that heritage, because of what my parents had provided for me in my home, and because of the Christian schooling I had experienced all the way along, I knew that something was a little bit off. And so I found it frustrating at times, even though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. And just to kind of wrap this up a little bit, I was actually, again, I have to credit my parents. I was visiting my parents in Florida, and I was in my dad's kind of study, and he had a book in there, and there were a couple of quotes by John Milton Gregory, who, as we know,
the 7 Laws of Teaching that you're referring to?
Yeah, absolutely.
We make extraordinary use of that book. We actually have a reprint that we sell, and the electronic copy, I think, is one that we still give away if people ask for it.
It's an amazing book, and I remember reading through it and saying, these are my kind of people. And as is often the case, one book leads to another. I was introduced to ACCS, and another, in the wider classical school community. And one thing led to another. And finally, I discovered that there was a community of people who were committed to the principles that I intrinsically knew to be true, or through my training, I knew to be true. And so I taught at a state university for a while, and then I came here in 2006 to Hillsdale College, and I've been here ever since. One quick addition to this is that when I arrived here at Hillsdale, Hillsdale was already committed to a liberal arts approach to education, but we were still preparing teachers primarily for public education through state certification. Within a couple of years, we realized that those demands from the state were inconsistent with the mission of the institution. So in 2008, we actually ended our relationship with the state of Michigan and moved our efforts entirely towards classical schools, charter schools, private schools, but also people who were working in traditional public schools, like I was directly out of college, who know intrinsically that there can be more and there has to be more, and we should be offering students more. And so we try to reach them as well, even though their work is kind of missionary work, I would argue, in the traditional public schools. So,
yeah. I don't want to go down this path too far, but in many instances, missionary work in a hostile land, so it has to be undercover.
Indeed it does.
Let me ask you, in your experience, we see an attack from the public schools. I don't know who all would be on board with this attack, but there is a general attack against a fair amount of classical children's literature. And I'm using the term classical in a very different way than we customarily use it when we say the phrase classical Christian education. So I can probably define that by saying traditional, surviving, common, the kinds of literature that many of us grew up with, has been attacked for some of its language and some of its context. What do you see happening there, and maybe why do you think it's happening?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think you're exactly right. And let me go back, to creation. I believe that God created us to be story loving and storytelling creatures, and that's we can communicate through other means, but we're drawn to stories in just amazing ways. And what's really I find fascinating is that people in the world of cognitive psychology are just confirming what we already knew within the classical community. So I'll point to one person, Dan Willingham at UVA. He's written on this, and he writes in a little bit of a different way, from a psychological perspective. But he says that stories are actually psychologically privileged in our minds. That's the language he uses. I would say again that work.
I can buy that. The terminology can mean a lot of different things, but if it means that it gets a special place for understanding, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And once again, I believe that God created us that way to be storytelling, to be story loving people. And so I can see it on a lot of the idea of great stories and passing along great stories is under attack from critical race theory, from the idea that in our present age we're going to use our present standards, if you could really call them standards, and we'll take stories written in a different time and we'll deconstruct them, and we of course can't learn anything, and I'm speaking from the education establishment point of view. We can't learn anything from stories because, after all, it was written in an earlier age when they had the wrong ideas. And so if we do read great stories, our task is to show just how close-minded these authors were, how trapped they were by all their beliefs and their commitments and all of that. So at best, we can just deconstruct these stories. So that's one angle of attack on great stories. You see a less overt attack in something, for lack of a better example, something like Common Core, where where and I know that, now a lot of people have dismissed this, but the main attack on stories through Common Core was not that, we should deconstruct them. It was just that we shouldn't read them at all. In fact, what Common Core did, it said, yes, we need to read, but we need to read more expository text, because that's what modern reading really is. And so let's downplay stories and let's upgrade expository text. And all I can think about is that example in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, when Lewis is describing Eustace and early on in the book, where he loved to read, these reports about grain elevators and children in foreign countries doing exercises. That's the kind of expository text that even back in the 40s and 50s were beginning to sneak in to literature and reading. And it's an avoidance or an effort to kind of downplay those classic stories that I would argue have actually shaped us, who we are as human beings.
Yeah, that's interesting. We tend, I think the masses, I think I tend to be a little bit tempted to do this, but we tend to be dismissive of the problem, or find the problem objectionable, but we haven't really thought through. And I think you make two good points in that I want to underscore as you've said them. One is that story has an elevated level of importance in how we understand who we are before God. And two, that story conveys a cultural heritage that many today want us to divorce ourselves from, in some sense, to reset culture in ways that counters those things that we have held dear for all of our lives. And those are both very important things to realize as we seek to retain that which others would try to eliminate. Really good.
Yeah, if I could add one more thing to that. There are authors who have made the case, going back to Russell Kirk, Vegan Groyan, William Kilpatrick. They've all made the case that when we make a moral choice in our lives, it isn't as if we rely exclusively on a list of rules that, and I'm not trying to downplay logic. We need to teach students to think carefully and to think logically, and to develop those patterns of thought. However, what those authors and others have pointed out is that oftentimes when we come to make those moral choices, we're actually led by those stories, and in kind of making those choices. And those authors refer to it as the moral imagination, having an imagination to be able to draw from those stories and those characters when we make those moral choices. So one point I want to articulate here is, if you have a generation or two or three of students who do not have that storehouse, or what Edmund Burke called a wardrobe of the moral imagination to draw from, that's pretty frightening. If they don't have those characters and those examples of good and evil in their mind from which they can draw and make a moral choice, that's frightening to me.
Yeah, interesting. I want to move on here for just a moment. You've written a book. Do you have the book handy that you can put it up on?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do. It's right here.
Tried and True. Thank you. And it is a book, as I understand it. Well, let me not try and define it. Tell us what problems were you trying to solve in writing the book?
Yeah, great. I appreciate that. Well, my inspiration for this, and I know others have been inspired by this kind of a book before, is the elements of style. Often people refer to it as Strunk and White. And
I'm familiar with it. We've sold it for years. I think it's out of print now.
I mean, it could be, but it is a great book. And in that book, what they say up front in the introduction is that they're not trying to define great writing, and they're not trying to define or teach all of composition. But what they are trying to do is they're trying to get writers off to a good start, give them fundamental principles that they can hold on to. Tried and true is the same kind of an effort. I remember what it was like coming into the classroom, and the the month or two before coming into the classroom, where I had to get ready to teach a lot of content. The last thing I wanted to have was to someone drop a 300-page book on my lap and say, "This is how we do teaching." So I told myself from the very beginning, I'm going to concentrate on just the basics. Let's get a floor level for good teaching, not adequate teaching, but good teaching. I'm not going to try to define great teaching because that takes years to cultivate, but I'm just going to try to start with good teaching. I'm going to give myself 100 pages to do that, no more than that, because I know how busy educators are. And so what I did was I actually laid out these 14 statements about good teaching. And if you want to, you can actually break them down into 4 categories. And I'll do it quickly. I call them the 4 M's. You start with the mission. Everything in a classical school should be mission driven. The school identifies what it is and what it does by the mission. And so the mission, we start everything with the mission. And then management. If you want to teach students, if you want to engage them in ideas, you have to be an authority, you have to lead, which means you have to be a manager. Everyone in the classroom, everyone out of the classroom is expecting you to be that manager. That's the school board, the administration, parents, even students expect you to manage. So if you can't manage, you're not going to be able to teach. Number 3 is the methods of instruction. And that's how to ask questions, how to lead a discussion, how to present an idea, how to do a review. And then the last is measurement. How do you know that you've actually achieved the goals that you've set out to accomplish? And so mission, management, methods, measurement are the 4 M's that are represented in Tried and True.
That is really good stuff. I need to become more familiar with that, and it seems like we would do well to promote it to our constituency.
Great.
What's been the reception of it? How long has it been around, and what kind of feedback do you get?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I call it my COVID book because, not a lot of great things came out of COVID. But when I was locked down in my home with my family, I kind of divided my time, spent a lot of time with my family playing Frisbee out on the front lawn. But then I would go back in the house and I would write. And actually, this is a culmination of almost 3 decades in the classroom. So I've had this in mind for a while. And so it was actually published in the summer of 2022. So we've had just about a year, and the response has been overwhelming and quite humbling in 2 ways. One is that I've received a lot of feedback from newer teachers who have said, thank you. I was kind of flying blind here, and at least you've given me something to start with. But more importantly has been the veteran teachers who have written me and who have said, this is confirming what I try to do in my classroom. And so to hear, veteran teachers of 2 or more decades, coming in and saying, this is, the kind of thing I wish I would have had when I started my career, and this would have launched me in a lot better way. That kind of praise, you just can't top. So anytime I get a veteran teacher, complimenting, the book is just music to my ears.
Yeah,
so
that's really neat. Well, I want to encourage the listeners to look into that book, and we need to look into it to see how we might make good use of it at Veritas for families and the people that we have a chance to influence and interact with. You have been a part of Hillsdale for how long now? Is it 6 or 7 years?
No, I actually arrived in 2006, so it's actually been 17 years. Okay. So yeah.
For some reason I was thinking it was 16 or 17. Okay, good. And Hillsdale has been a wonderful institution maintaining financial independence from entanglements with state monies and then state influence, whether that be at a federal level or more localized things. And those have all been very good things. They have, as you mentioned, terminated relationships in favor of relationships that are more enduring and not driven with the same kind of concerns in their agendas. But it remains officially a secular classical education. Is that a fair assessment of it?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I actually get this question fairly often. Number one, I need to say, I teach at the college. I have the honor of playing the role of the dean of the graduate school here. In some way, I can speak for the college, but I would also encourage people to, go to the website, read the mission statement for itself, and allow the college to speak for itself. But I'll articulate, my understanding of it. And I've been here for almost 2 decades. I should be able to do this. So Hillsdale College identifies itself as a Christian college. And when it uses the word Christian, again, going back to C.S. Lewis, I would argue it's kind of talking about the hallway, that C.S. Lewis describes, that he's going to talk about in Mere Christianity. So it's not specifically denominational or to a particular tradition. It's broadly Christian in that regard. And so that's the institution as a whole. Let me talk about the effort towards K-12. Hillsdale has been trying to contribute to K-12 education at large for well over 100 years. We actually founded in 1844.
That's amazing. We're not far away from 200 years.
Yeah, getting very close. My own children attend Hillsdale Academy, which was opened more than 3 decades ago. And that is an explicitly Christian K-12 school. It's right on our campus. It holds chapel. It has a chaplain. The teachers are very free to be able to bring the scriptures into classroom. And I am incredibly grateful for that. About 10 years ago, though, we had some people who came to the college and who said, man, the kind of education that's going on at Hillsdale Academy needs to be available to a wider population. Well, our response was, well, we've been trying to do that for over 3 decades in providing our resource guides to people who want to follow, the curriculum. With the people who were interested in this model, they specifically wanted to target charter schools. And they said, is there a way where we could provide this kind of education in a context where people who were, for whatever reason, were not able to or chose not to homeschool or were not able to send their students to a private school? Is there any way that we can try to reform public education in this space called charter schooling? And so around 2009, 2010, we made a real effort. And when I say we have a K-12 office on campus, which is primarily focused outwardly. It's an external kind of facing office. I'm in the education department. I'm much more internal facing in terms of I teach undergraduates and I teach graduates. But that external focus this K-12 office was trying to, can we provide a quality education within this charter school context, seeing that 90+% of the population goes to traditional, public schools. Is there something we could do in this space? And I think what Hillsdale has done is quite admirable. We've created a curriculum, a K-12 curriculum, trying to base in the Western tradition, trying to draw from that tradition to provide the best education we possibly can within that space according to the laws of the land. Now, my own preference and the choice that my wife and I make is that we want our children to be able to attend a Christian school, and so they do. And we're really grateful for that. But we're trying to be able to speak into those communities. And I'll just add one additional thing. Our K-12 office has actually expanded its effort and is now looking to help more private schools, explicitly Christian schools as well. In addition, we're also trying to help homeschoolers as well. again, we're the kind of institution that we're just trying to create resources and make them available. And if there are even, as I said early on, going back to the early stages of my career, um, even as an educator, a Christian educator in a traditional public school, if I would have had the resources that Hillsdale is providing, I would have welcomed them openly. So we kind of have this very broad tent. Can we provide these resources to a wide audience? And so we're not selective exclusively to charter schools. We're trying to reach all those communities.
That's really good to hear. And that really does round out a better understanding than I had before asking the question, before you answering it.
Sure.
The reason that I'm so concerned about this, there's been recent conversation about the death of cultural Christianity. I've been going through a book called The De-Churching. I forget what it's called, De-Churching of America or something like that. It's written by a couple Orlando pastors. And it's talking about the falling numbers in church attendance. And it, along with some other things that I have been looking at and reading, has talked about the fact that cultural Christianity seems to be on hard times. I don't see that as a bad thing. Christianity is not first and foremost culture. It impacts culture, but Christianity has to be understood for what it really is. It's not you can do better. It's not the virtue that we see with the ancients is something that we should emulate. Christianity is first and foremost, God is holy, man is not. Man, in order to have a relationship with God, needs to recognize that holiness and that perfection is required as a result. And we are not perfect, and we need an intermediary. We need someone to make us perfect in order to relate. And no amount of effort will make us more good, more true, or more beautiful in a sense that will approach the holiness of the God with whom we need to be able to relate. And of course, what that means is Jesus Christ came to save the lost, to save me, save us. And at a practical level, I've said this before, and I've said it even on this podcast. If we Google the 10 most important events in history, I went, I think, 26 pages deep and never found the death, resurrection, the incarnation, or anything that related to the person of Jesus Christ. I don't know how we can make a list of the 10 most important events in history without the one that has affected everything since it's happened.
Yeah, you almost get the sense in order to do that, it has to be intentional, right?
It does. It absolutely does. Yeah, there's no other way to explain it. So, what difference does it make in our education if it is not distinctly recognizing that which I got in none of my public education, and that is Christianity is true, it's real, and if we don't understand it, we don't understand the truth of what we're learning.
Yeah, it's a great question. As you're talking, I'm even thinking back to Proverbs. I don't want to lean on my own understanding, right? Because I know how fallen a creature I am, and so if classical education leads to some kind of some kind of moralism or something like that,
That's
I just need
word,
to try.
by the way. It is moralism.
Yeah. If I just need to try harder to be a good person, well, I think we can go to the Word and we can discover that that's going to fail mightily. In fact, you could argue that the Old Testament is a description of that failure, to live a moral life. So I'm in total agreement with you. And again, I think a complete education would include that in that idea that, I'm not called to be perfect in my own ability. I'm called, to look to Christ as my Savior, to cover my inadequacies. And so I think that's part of a complete education. But I understand your broader question, and it is a concern to me. Let me just add this in terms of our efforts in spaces where, according to law, we're not able to bring these issues up like I would like to bring them up. And it's a very delicate balance, too, that what you see in traditional public education, for the most part, is not just that they don't talk about these principles, that you and I have just been talking about. It's that they're antithetical to them, and that they're aligned. They're aligned against them.
There is a religion being taught. It's not
absolutely
separation. It is a religion being taught, and it's anti. What we believe, anti-Christian.
Yeah. And here's where it gets a little bit controversial. In that, when we try to operate in these public spaces, what we try to do is we try to articulate, we are not antithetical to faith, to the principles of Christianity, but because of the laws that are in place, whether we like them or not, we have to operate in this way. But we're not going to be antithetical. In fact, we're going to, at the top of the list, just talking about in educational terms, is that parents are the first and often the best educators. And schools are a resource for which parents can draw upon. Well, when you take that posture, you even in a public space, you're allowing for that cultivation of faith to occur in the home, to occur in the church, to occur in that community. Is that the ideal? Again, I would say no, but at least it's a lot better than what's going on in a traditional public spaces.
I can't argue that it's not better. It is. But we could go on for hours on this. Our time is up, and it's been a wonderful thing to be able to talk to you about these things. Thank you, Dr. Daniel Coupland. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Marlene.
Folks, you've been with us at Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education. Look forward to seeing you next time.